A very good day to you and welcome to this special broadcast with a very special conversation. Today we will be in conversation with Peter Zalmayev. He's a political scientist, he's director of the Euro-Asia Democracy Initiative, which is actually a very interesting civil society organization, and he's currently in Namibia at a time when the war in Ukraine is raging on. As the United States pushes for a possible peace settlement, Africa continues to feel the ripple effects of the conflict itself, particularly in its reliance on Ukrainian grain, scholarship opportunities, broader development ties, the economy at large, etc., etc. Well, despite efforts by several African heads of state to mediate this situation, the war has just persisted. The big question then is, how can this war be brought to an end, and what meaningful role can African countries and Namibia in particular play in supporting peace efforts? Peter Zalmayev joins us live to share his insights. Peter, thanks a lot for being with us today, and welcome to Namibia. I'm not sure if it's your first time.
First time.
First time, welcome to Namibia. Hoping that you are enjoying it. Speak to us then, what actually brings you to Namibia at this time, Peter, and how does it relate to the work that you're doing at Euro-Asia Democratic Initiative?
Well, I'm a broadcaster in Ukraine. For the past 7 years, I've had a weekly TV program in Ukraine, and in the last 3 years of war, I was in Kiev broadcasting every day, giving interviews, taking interviews, going live on CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC. Ukraine has become sort of in the spotlight, has gotten in the spotlight since the start of the war. And in September, I decided to just venture out and go into the wide world and talk to folks in countries that normally have no contact with Ukraine. Some of them don't even have diplomatic relations with Ukraine, such as this country of Papua New Guinea, a remote place in the South Pacific, north of Australia, with hundreds of languages, and in Pacific Islands, Australia, New Zealand. Finally, I'm here, and I'm going to make my way, hopefully, by land all the way to Ethiopia, through about 20 African countries. Talking about Ukraine, talking about why it is important, the outcome, why it's important not just for that part of the world or for Ukrainians, but it's an identity struggle. It's not a struggle for some land or territory. It's a truly civilizational battle. But whereas before November, the November elections in the U.S., I would have been more, I think, clear-headed and clear-eyed and kind of certain about which side, which country is on after the election of Donald Trump and what he said and the way he's related to Vladimir Putin. I will be lying if I told you that I have the same certainty about the U.S. and what role it is playing. We're living in very confusing times, and yet I still try to stick to the very simple message that the war in Ukraine is about right versus wrong. It is about a struggle of a country to keep its identity as a democratic, liberal democracy.
A few years down the line now, 2 to 3 years down the line of the war, what is the state of the conflict in Ukraine as we speak?
Still very much ongoing. And a lot of people will ask me, like, is the war still going on? Just because people don't see it on the front pages anymore, it doesn't mean that it went away anywhere. Contrary to Trump's efforts to bring peace to the war, where I don't think we're anywhere near to the resolution. As political scientists will tell you, wars that go on for at least a year have all the chances to go at least 5 years. The longer these wars go on, the harder it is to stop them, to reach any sort of a full-fledged peace resolution. So as Vladimir Putin is trying to drag out the time and convince Trump that he's interested in these peace negotiations, bombs are raining on Ukrainian cities such as Kryvyi Rih. That's where President Zelensky is from. Just the last week, there were over 20 people dead, including some children. And that's happening as Vladimir Putin supposedly is engaged in peace talks. It just tells you that.
And from your perspective on those peace talks, how realistic do you think it is?
The way Donald Trump has shaped, approached this conflict and his campaign promise of settling it within 24 hours is completely unrealistic. It's simplistic, but it's very much par for the course for a president who, professes to view the world as like very black and white, very simple, this, that, and the other. But not when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Apparently for him, we're just a bunch of shades of gray. He doesn't see this as, a cause that U.S. should support by all means, which is what his predecessor did. He's actually trying to negotiate with Ukraine a deal whereby Ukraine would turn over its rare earths and other deposits in return for U.S. help, as though this was a loan, even though it wasn't. You see, once again, very cynical times, very cynical maneuvers. But having said that, Ukrainians are still resisting. It's a very uneven fight, as you know, and Vladimir Putin has thrown everything at it. He's now, as you know, engaged thousands of North Korean soldiers to fight in Ukraine, right? And once again, he's continuing to target civilian areas to make it very painful for Ukrainians, to make them essentially give up and capitulate.
You've spoken about the issue of the rare earth minerals. Perhaps just from the different players that are in that war right now, what are the geopolitical interests at play?
I think the main geopolitical influence is that of Vladimir Putin. He's basically, staked his whole political and physical life on the outcome of this conflict. Russia is trying to portray itself as the sort of spearheading this war, the struggle against this Yankee Western imperialism or neo-imperialism, right? And I suspect that China is also kind of right now happy with Russia's kind of role as the disruptor, the spoiler. It's this Putin really wants nothing less than a redivision of the world, sort of like what we had after World War II, where Russia would be considered on equal terms with China and, let's say, the United States, even though Russia is really a junior partner to China. And Putin has sold Russia off to China to keep his war effort going after all these thousands of sanctions, as you know. And so, our message is very simple. That Vladimir Putin is trying to hide his war crimes in Ukraine by saying that he's leading this neo-imperialist struggle, including on the African continent, where Russia has a claim that we supported this, including, I know Russia supported, the Soviet Union supported Namibia's independence. It fought against apartheid. So Russia has a kind of advantage on this terrain. It was never colonial power. But at the same time, the way they're doing it is very cynical, because it's nothing else other than a neo-colonial war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. It's a war of conquest. And that is our problem. So yesterday's anti-colonials have become colonials themselves. And that's what Russia is doing with Ukraine.
You bring up the issue of Africa, and I mean, many years later, after the fight against apartheid was won, there are now relations between Namibia and Ukraine, between Namibia and Russia. How has the war in Ukraine affected the positions of those relationships, especially in African countries? You look at food security, education opportunities. What has that war done?
The war's effects have reverberated across the world, including in remote South Pacific countries like Samoa, Tonga, Fiji. Some of these islands, I went there specifically to talk to people, and they said immediately we felt, obviously, foodstuffs. The price for food has gone up, and fuel went up tremendously. So food security, cost of fuel, all of that has been felt immediately. On the African continent, Russia has played a very disruptive, I think, role as well, with Niger and Mali and Cote d'Ivoire and Chad and Sudan, with its mercenaries in Central African Republic, aiding in the effort to oust lawfully elected governments. Niger has asked both the French and the U.S. military bases out of the country, right? And Russians have moved in. So Russians are now assuming this role of a kind of neo-colonial power that is trying to take advantage of, certain countries where it helps to, bring to power various different elements, It's a very cynical game. And Ukraine is kind of playing catch-up. Ukraine has a long way to go to put together and put forward its own narrative in Africa. We have never had such, developed relations here. We don't have nearly the staff, the capability, right, diplomatically or otherwise to match Russia's efforts, right? Russia's engaged in outright propaganda, as you know. But we are, I think, Ukraine is having some success in actually finally, getting it off the ground. Its messaging in Africa. It's opened several new embassies since the war started, and the previous foreign minister has called it nothing else than a renaissance in Africa-Ukraine relations. And just a case in point, in a few days, I think in about a week or so, President Zelensky will be visiting Pretoria in meeting with Cyril Ramaphosa. And that is a first, and that is a very
big.
good step.
That's a big step indeed. On the issue of African countries, Donald Trump is not the first one to look for peace in the Ukraine conflict. When he did start, African countries in particular were the first ones to advocate for a peaceful settlement or just peace generally in Ukraine. Why do you think those efforts of the African cause have fallen on deaf ears?
Will it be okay? Can you repeat the question?
Okay.
Is that okay?
That's fine.
I just
That's okay. So we've seen Donald Trump asking for peace, looking for a peace solution. It's not the first time we've seen that. The African countries themselves, African leaders have asked for peaceful solution to this conflict since the very moment it started. Why do you think, though, that African leaders haven't been taken seriously when they ask for these peace solutions?
Yeah, it just brings back to memory 2 years ago, 9 African heads of state visited Kiev. If you may recall, they came under shelling, so they had to go into hiding. There was an air raid in Kiev at that time, And so, yes, it was a very important symbolic gesture, but it didn't really bring any concrete, results, simply because, once again, it all boils down to the will of one gentleman, and that is Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin will decide when to end the war. If he wants to end the war, it will end today, It's that simple. So I wouldn't really denigrate the efforts of African heads of state or African countries in this respect. I mean, look at what India has tried to mediate, Turkey has tried to mediate with very mixed results, and now Saudi Arabia. So not for lack of trying, but at this juncture, once again, considering how obsessed and fixated Vladimir Putin is on Ukraine, it's not really up to anyone else to influence him. I think the one major power, the one power that could influence it, other than Putin himself, is China. I mean, he's prosecuting this war at China's largesse, even though China has this kind of hands-off, hands-off position. They claim they don't really support the war or anything, unless they were continuing to buy Russia's oil and gas and trading with Russia and selling Russia dual-use technology and use chip that could be used in military, right? And fighter jets, whatever, Russia would, Russia's war machinery would stop immediately, So I think it's China. It's China where I think the answer lies.
So is there then any role that African countries, Namibia in particular, can play diplomatically or otherwise to contribute to the efforts of peace or even humanitarian assistance?
I think it's very important for Namibia, for Africa. I'm not here to tell Namibia or any other country not to have dealings with Russia. It's very naive. And I know, just the other day, it was announced that Namibia and Russia are going to be engaged in atomic, collaboration of some sort. And I understand that. And so these are bilateral issues, etc. But I think, and this is what Ramaphosa's decision to meet with Zelensky, I think testifies to the fact that, African countries can have and should have their own kind of leeway in who they talk to, who they don't talk to. Their membership in, let's say, BRICS, right? China, South Africa should not be taken for granted, and I think that's the message being sent. And when it comes to Namibia, it's once again we come back to the vote at the General Assembly of the UN. How will Namibia continue to vote in these votes? So far, it has condemned Russia's aggression. Will it now abstain if it's now getting engaged economically with Russia? I would hope not. I would hope that African countries, and Namibia specifically, would continue to show they know what's right and what's wrong when it comes to the war in Ukraine.
Peter, still so much to talk about, not much time left, unfortunately. What's your message to Namibians who perhaps are on either side of the divide but want to support the efforts of a lasting, peaceful solution in what is a very distant conflict but hits you right at home?
I would just appeal to folks anywhere in Namibia and elsewhere to be very careful about their sources of information, the newspapers they read, and the claims that are being made. That Russia once again has engaged in a multi-million-dollar propaganda campaign directed at Africa and other countries. To make various arguments and claims what the war is about. It's tried to portray itself as the victim. That is to prevent NATO's expansion. All these other things, most of them, and these are serious arguments that we have to deal with. But I think, Namibians, among others, have to understand that, a lot of this information is nothing but pure propaganda. And that's just to be wary, and to be skeptical. We're living in very, weird, strange times where anyone can get online and be a source of information, where Twitter has become X and has become this repository of toxic discourse, right, and fake news, etc. People who are decrying fake news are the ones who are the greatest purveyors of fake news. So my appeal is to be very wary of it.
Peter, thanks a lot for your time and all the best.
Thank you, sir.
Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Well, that was Peter Zalmayev. He's a political scientist and director of the Euro-Asia Democracy Initiative. He's here in Namibia to talk about the situation in Ukraine as the war still rages on. We're yet to see what a peace deal looks like, if at all it will happen, or even perhaps a ceasefire. Those conversations have since been halted. Well, we'll see where it goes. Thanks a lot for tuning in to this special broadcast.